So now we're going to hear from Professor Donald Johanson, whose discovery of Lucy brought about the redrawing of the human family. She represents the last common ancestor of two evolutionary lineages, one that resulted in extinction, and the other which led to us, Homo sapiens. As we continue to accumulate the pieces to our genetic heritage, questions arise as to how Lucy and her species were able to survive for nearly 1 million years. And what were the conditions that led to the later diversification of the hominin species? As Professor Johanson describes, Lucy has become an ambassador to humankind roots and inspires a deeper understanding of our place in nature and our responsibility as stewards of planet Earth. Let us now welcome Professor Donald Johanson, who will speak on Our Place in the Future, Lessons from a 3 million-year-old Ancestor.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I want to wish all of you a very warm welcome to these 2 days that will be really quite remarkable. And I want to thank Bengt and Lori for organizing this and recognizing that this year is a rather special celebratory year for me. It was 50 years ago, as you heard, when I was a newly minted doctorate from the University of Chicago, that I uncovered the remains of a partial skeleton, which has come to be known popularly as Lucy. Lori has also asked me to say a few words about how I became interested in what is called paleoanthropology, which I always say is not the study of old anthropologists, but the study of human origins. Very unusual for a young boy growing up in Connecticut and of Swedish parents, so I'm thrilled to be back in the homeland. My mother and father came from Norrköping and settled in the United States, and I still have relatives that I will be visiting next week, who are coming over from Norrköping to have lunch together. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be in Sweden and to visit my relatives. But my mother and father immigrated to the United States in, sounds like ancient history, in early 1920s. And I was born in the United States. And as a young boy, my mother and I, my father had passed away when I was very young. We moved in with her sister and brother-in-law in a place called Hartford, Connecticut, on the east side of the United States. And it was an interesting move because I encountered and met a professor of anthropology, a German-educated professor, Paul Leser, who was studying cultural anthropology. And I wasn't particularly interested in that. I was much more interested in collecting salamanders and butterflies and scaring rabbits and trying to understand the natural world around me, and developed a real interest in that natural world. But Paul gave me a gift that was quite extraordinary, and that was access to his library. And there were very, very few books in my house. And one of the books that I encountered was a book published in 1863 by Charles Darwin's, one of his closest friends, Thomas Henry Huxley. And that book was called Man's Place in Nature, which really forms the sort of philosophical framework in which I approach my study. I think it's enormously important that we understand our roots, and enormously important that we understand that we are part of the natural world, no matter how technological we become. And that we really continue to have respect for the natural world. When we think of who is our creator, my answer is, just as Spinoza said, the natural world. And when we make these discoveries, such as Lucy, people ask me very frequently, is she the missing link? And we don't like to use that term, but each and every fossil that we find that fits on the human family tree was a missing link until we discovered it, of course. But it's also important to remember that it's a link to the natural world. We look at these reconstructed creatures, as you see on the screen. We're looking at a male and a female of Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis. And they were an integral, intimate, creative part of the natural world. They weren't some totally independent creature. When I was an undergraduate, we used an introductory book to anthropology in which the author said that because we are so dependent on culture, we are super organic, beyond biology. And it was at that point that I realized that certainly we are not independent of the natural world, no matter how much we have changed since that common ancestor with the African apes some 7, 8, 9 million years ago. And after finishing my doctorate and also having a sleepless night before I had to defend my thesis, I left the University of Chicago and went off to Africa. And I had an especially prickly, difficult member of my committee who I think was more out to sink me than to help me. And he was asking very difficult questions, and I finally passed. And he said, "Don, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to Africa, and I'm going to find something." So it was wonderful. The sweet revenge was when I found Lucy. I wrote him a postcard and said, "Found something." So today, I want to talk about sort of the current state of knowledge about our earliest ancestors around 3 to 4 million years, and to introduce you to what sort of drives my work. Last week, I had a grand surprise. This is Science Magazine, a magazine that all of you probably are familiar with. There are two major science magazines internationally. One of them is Nature, which is published in the United Kingdom. The other is published by the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And on this 50th anniversary, which came as a significant surprise to me, they revisited that discovery. And there was a short article written by one of their editors, and they put Lucy, at least a reconstruction of her, on the cover of the magazine Science. So this year is a very busy year, a very rewarding year, to look back on those 50 years and to review some of the interesting developments as well as the general state of knowledge. As you probably know, if I were to ask how many in this audience accept evolution as the most significant explanation for how life came to be, how it came to be so diverse, and how it is continuing to craft life on this planet. In the United States, lamentably, that is not the case. We have 40, maybe 50% of people who do not accept evolution. And when I lecture there and I look out to an audience like this, I can barely see you with these interrogation lights on. And I say, how many of you believe in evolution? Very few hands go up. And I always say, well, you'll be very, very surprised that I don't believe in evolution either, any more than I believe in gravity. And Darwin, who gets blamed for all of this, because he said that all creatures on this planet that are animals, plants, et cetera, came to us through the process of natural selection. And in fact, in 1859, when he published his Origin of Species, the only thing that he wrote in that book was on the last page where he said, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. And that was a very cautious statement. He did not want to come into conflict with the clergy, but it was, of course, inescapable. And he got much more daring in his final edition of the book when he changed that and said, much light will be thrown. A true English understatement. And Darwin was very much in touch with his close colleague, Thomas Henry Huxley. And Huxley, who wrote Man's Place in Nature, the book that sparked my interest, and the spark that did that was the fact that we and the African apes, they predicted, and particularly Huxley wrote very clearly on the last paragraph, penultimate paragraph to his book, that the similarities in the skeletons of the great apes and us suggests a commonality of origin. And the closest resemblances reside in the African apes. So as you see, he wrote, it is quite certain that the ape which most nearly approaches man in the totality of its organization is either the chimpanzee or the gorilla. And this is part of the process of science that we all understand, that we make predictions, we develop hypotheses that we hope will turn into theories and facts, but we have to begin somewhere. And at that time, they had no fossils from Africa. They had Neanderthal man from Germany, but the French, particularly outspoken about that, who wants to be evolved from a Neanderthal, but very little else. So they used comparative evidence to make this important suggestion. Now, Darwin, I can imagine him at his famous sand walk in Kent, in England. I have visited his home, and walking with Huxley or having tea in the garden and discussing this. And ultimately, Darwin began to take more definitive steps towards addressing the fact that humans must also have arrived. And I'll be touching on a number of things he talked about. But in 1871, he wrote a book called Descent of Man, and began to consider the relationship and the process and the unique features by which apes became human. He didn't know when. He knew that there was deep time on the planet. He needed that, of course. And he eventually got it. And this is a diagram of his from just before the Descent of Man was published, and his handwriting is miserable. But you can see on the left he has what he calls man. This would be people or humanity or humankind. And he draws a branching diagram suggesting affinities between these various species or genera, and the fact that there must have been sort of a common ancestor. More than once I've been challenged in the States in saying, well, if we evolved from chimpanzees, why are they still here? Well, we didn't evolve from chimpanzees. We and chimpanzees evolved from a common ancestor. And Darwin went further and said, who are our closest relatives, and deduced that, of course, this was the chimpanzee. What attributes distinguish us from other species, and particularly from our ape cousins? And who were the earliest ancestors? And of course, at that time, the earliest ancestors were Neanderthals, but he didn't consider them in his ideas very profoundly. But he did predict, like Huxley did, that Africa would be the homeland. That would be the crucible in which natural selection crafted our ancestors, leading ultimately to Homo sapiens. And what were the causes of human emergence? And I must say, we are still struggling with that question, but there is increasing, tantalizing evidence that at certain times there were dramatic climate change in Africa that was responded in the environment and ecological setting, and this stimulated changes and new adaptations to survival. So we know that the chimpanzee is the closest living relative, and I think you recognize somebody there as a human. And there are some potential divergent states here that with gibbons in Southeast Asia, probably the first to strike out on their own. You know, back in the Miocene, say more than 10 million years ago, it really was the planet of the apes. There were tens of genera and many, many species in Africa, also in Europe, and also throughout the Middle East and in Asia. But the separation dates are somewhere between roughly 7 and 8 million years for our separation on the tree. So, yet we are highly divergent in anatomy and behavior, which is clear to all of us. And in this little graph, I just show the common ancestor and show the fact that chimpanzees probably are closer to that common ancestor in terms of behavior and anatomy. We don't know exactly what their anatomy was because we don't have a really good common ancestor yet. But we have diverged greatly, as you can see, in terms of morphological distance from that common ancestor. The distinguishing features that captivated Darwin were the fact that we are bipedal, that we walk upright, that all other primates, in fact all other mammals really, are quadrupedal. So this was a major dramatic change in the way we get around in our locomotor system. We have, for the size animal we are, a fairly large brain, relatively speaking, compared to the other primates. Lucy, for example, had a brain that was only about 400 cubic centimeters. The average brain in this room is somewhere around 1,400 cubic centimeters. So that's a very significant increase. There isn't a one-to-one relationship between intelligence and brain size, but when you more than triple the size of the brain, there must be something unique happening. We are dependent on technology today to a very large extent, and a kind of technology or culture that is cumulative, that builds very rapidly on itself. If we just look back at the last 100 years, you can see how incredibly fast our cultural evolution has been. We are very slow maturing. We have long, extended childhoods. It's because we have so darn much to learn to be a human. Chimpanzees have a much shorter, a faster maturation because they live in a much less complicated world. We have elaborated social learning in a way that is incomparable to other animals on the planet. And the other really distinguishing characteristic is that we have symbolic language. And language allows us to talk about and construct the world out there in symbolic ways, which is totally different from what any other animal can do, as far as we know. And there is, of course, one other aspect I would highlight, and that is that we are probably the most cooperative animal on the planet. It doesn't look that way with what we read in the newspapers, but in fact, we cooperate with anyone, not just those who we went to high school with or those who are in our neighborhood. We might sit down and begin a cooperative study on the internet with someone we never met. Whereas if we were chimpanzees and we were living as a troop here in Lund, and there was another troop of chimpanzees in Copenhagen from where I just came, if they came into our territory, we would kill and eat them if we were chimps. So I think cooperation is something that needs to be considered fairly strongly. So the closest ancestor, obviously chimpanzee. So what happened here? What was it that drove the diversification of different lineages at 6 to 8 million years ago? And only fossils can really answer that question. That was the one thing that Darwin and Huxley did not have, but their prognostication was that Africa would be the crucible. That's where we would find the earliest and most ape-like human ancestors. As I said, Darwin became much more adventurous in his later writings. He wrote, "In each great region of the world, the living mammals are closely related to the extinct species of the same region." He further said, "It is therefore probable that Africa was formerly inhabited by extinct apes closely allied to the gorilla and chimpanzee. And as these two species are now man's nearest allies, it is somewhat more probable that our early progenitors lived on the African continent than elsewhere." So this is very interesting to read these three paragraphs and to understand how Darwin was thinking and how he came to the conclusion that he did. So in Africa, very little was known about Africa at that time in terms of the geology and paleontology. There had been very little exploration, and it wasn't until 1924 when this cheerful man, Raymond Dart, who was a medical doctor at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He was building the medical school there. And miners were mining limestone caves for materials to help produce cement. And they occasionally came across animal remains, fossilized animal remains. And one of his, he asked one of the people working at a cave known as Tong to send him anything that he found. And he sent him this child skull, which he published in 1925, much to the consternation of all of his professors in England, who objected that he published much too quickly. And what does he know about fossils? We are the people who know about fossils. But yet he gave it a name, to Australopithecus africanus. And for many years, the focus was on these South African caves, where fossils are still being discovered. Then in the 1950s, there was a very dramatic change from the South African to the East African arena, which was undertaken by probably a family that all of us know, the late Louis and Mary Leakey, at a place called Olduvai Gorge, which is a gorge cut into the Serengeti, just at the base of volcanoes. where on July 17th, 1959, they recovered this skull of a very robustly built Australopithecus, which gave it a new name, Australopithecus boisei. It had a massive face. It had a crest for the temporalis muscles, huge attachments for the masseters. This was sort of the Cuisinart of human ancestry for processing food. And Olduvai led to a number of other people who wanted to explore other regions of Eastern Africa. One of those people was my late friend, Maurice Taïeb, a French geologist who explored the Afar Triangle you see up there at the northeastern extremity of the Great Rift Valley, where the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea come together, a very interesting area geologically. And we launched an exploratory expedition in 1972. And in 1973, we came back with a full-fledged, multidisciplinary, integrated expedition, the International Afar Research Expedition. And this picture was one of the first views I saw of these geological deposits. And it's absolutely the best dream any paleoanthropologist can have. Rock strata that have a sequence from older at the bottom, younger at the top, had white layers of volcanic ash that could date these fossils, and so on. So, and when we drove down in there, it was just littered with fossils. Elephants, rhinos, gazelles, monkeys. And the hope was that we would find human ancestor fossils. So in 1974, the year that really defined my career, I had the occasion at this locality. We number all of these particular localities. Locality 288, where you see that little yellow dot, to recover this partial skeleton known as Lucy, or as Australopithecus afarensis. And as you all know, she was named after the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that was playing during our celebration. And that particular bone happened to be the proximal ulna, the bone that allows us to flex and extend. It's got that little notch there. You see my student, he's doing all the work, of course. And on the right, you see that little piece of bone that bore the anatomy of a human ancestor, not of a monkey or an antelope or whatever. And it is called, we call her Lucy. In our language, Ethiopians call her Dinkinesh, the commemorative stamp you see, which means you are wonderful. When I announced Lucy as Australopithecus afarensis in 1978, it was not terribly well received by my colleagues, who had very different ideas that they did not want to change. But what is significant for me, with my Swedish ancestry and being in Sweden today, is that that announcement took place in Karlskoga, Sweden, where Nobel had his factory. A book on current argument on early man was published, and a photographer happened to be at that conference who I knew, and he knew I was going to sort of drop this bomb at the conference. And he took this picture, and this is the first time the scientific name Australopithecus afarensis was mentioned to a larger audience. One of the great debates that we had was, remember Darwin said one of the great features was bipedality, standing up, walking on two legs, freeing the arms to do other sorts of things. And we were able to mirror image Lucy's pelvis, which is crucial. We had the knee and we had the ankle. And with detailed anatomical comparative study and biomechanics, we concluded that this creature, afarensis, in particular Lucy, was fully upright and bipedal. And when you compare a modern human on the left, all of us in this room, Homo sapiens, our pelvis with Lucy's pelvis, to a chimpanzee pelvis, you know, you don't need to be a PhD in anatomy or paleoanthropology to say, well, is Lucy's pelvis more similar to pelvis A or to B? So this was a confirmation that her species was bipedal. And following that, it stimulated other detailed field and laboratory research. And a site in Tanzania, when Dr. Mary Leakey was at this conference, and was reminded of a site that she and her husband had visited in the 1930s, where there were no tools. And, you know, they had this preconceived notion, and we always, as scientists, have to be concerned about recognizing our biases. And they believed that there could be no human at this site of Laetoli 3.7 million years ago because there were no tools. Well, another thing that Darwin talked about, but tools, while we separated 6 to 7, 8 million years ago, the oldest stone tools we know of today are about 2.6 million. So for a vast amount of our evolutionary background, we did not make tools. But when she went back, she began to find teeth and jaws, particularly, which are very useful for understanding the numbers of species, that were identical. The one on the left is from Laetoli, the one on the right is from Laetoli, from Hadar, sorry. And with that degree of similarity, we would put them into the same species. So we decided that there were at least 2 of our ancestors walking across that landscape, and fortunately, there was a volcanic ash that had just erupted from a volcano, and it was filled with little raindrops. It was a little muddy. Of course, they didn't wear shoes in those days, so we could look at the soft anatomy. It didn't have a 8-foot like that, a grasping organ. It had a foot just like ours, with a strong heel strike, with a longitudinal and transverse arch to the foot, and very strong toe off. So she has been reconstructed by a paleo artist, as you see here, with a foot very much like ours, and without doubt, now they were certainly proven to be walking upright. One thing we didn't have that was very important were skulls. And when we have a break and you're looking for one of your friends to have coffee with today, what part of the anatomy are you going to be looking at? You're going to be looking at the skull. The skull has the telltale features of who is who. And that is the same thing with skeletal anatomy in terms of understanding species diversity and adaptations and so on. But we now have a male and female, fairly complete skulls. And recently, some work has been done in virtual space to recreate endocranial volume. And what's so exciting about that is that these estimates of endocranial volume are about 20% larger than the average for chimpanzees. And the other thing that is so interesting is that the topical anatomy of the brain, which is impressed on the inside of the skull, and the position of certain grooves and sulci, such as the lunate sulcus, is very ape-like. So that had not changed. But what did change, and what is really fascinating, is when a baby afarensis skull, and we have now several infants, is compared with an infant chimpanzee, they're about the same size. But the adult skulls are more than 20% larger, which means that maybe this was the beginning of extended childhood. What I did at that meeting in Karlskoga was not only talk about the new species, but the relationships, this is a hypothesis, it's just a way of communicating relationships. And I predicted that Afarensis was a common ancestor to these two larger branches that Laurie spoke about, later Australopithecines like Boisei, and also for our own genus Homo. And it was, I was young and adventurous and bold and made that statement, and it came crashing down on me. Don, you understand that there's a gap of 1,200,000 years between what you're saying, between Lucy and her descendants? So over the next many years, the next 50 years, we continued to search for fossils. Afarensis now is known from well over 500 specimens that range in age from 3.9 to 2.9 million years, which means that this is a very long-lived species. We are very egotistical. I sometimes call us Homo egocentricus. We think that we will go on forever, that we will not face extinction. And as individuals like ourselves, around 200,000 years ago, we see skulls like ours, an anatomy like ours. So we've been around a fairly short period of time. But what is so important about recognizing the numbers of specimens is that when new species, whether it be insects or whether it be dinosaurs or fossil horses or whatever, we do this on the basis of a type specimen. Just as Linnaeus said, you had to choose a type specimen. But it doesn't tell us the range of variation over time. It doesn't tell us the range of variation over geography. And it doesn't tell the range of variation over lifespan. But we now have over 500 specimens, beautifully complete specimens that allow us to reconstruct with confidence this particular species. Darwin also was interested in brains and tools. He had a sense that all this happened at once. We left the trees, we came to the ground, we became bipedal, we stood up, we had free hands, we had big brains that allowed us to make tools, and better tools, bigger brains, better tools. We now know that that is decoupled, that the first thing we did was really stand up. That was the spark that led to the diversity on the human family tree. And the first major brain expansion at about 1.6 million, 1.7 million years, you had brains that, at least the endocranial volume, that was well over 1,000 cubic centimeters. And they were associated with stone tools. Certainly they were scavenging and perhaps even hunting in a very rudimentary way. But still, that persistent problem of what went on between 2 and 3 million years. And more recently, we have found stone tools at 2.6 million years associated with a maxilla, as you see in the upper right, the upper jaw. An ape jaw or an Afarensis jaw has long and parallel sides. It's fairly narrow, but very long from front to back. Ours tends to be very wide. It tends to be in a somewhat of a parabolic shape and is very short from front to back, mainly because of the reduction of the snout area. And we found this mandible, or this maxilla, in the early 1990s, and in association with this stone tool that you see me holding in the left side of this. This is a flake that was purposefully struck from a core and was associated with animal bones that showed cut marks. So this was a major breakthrough and a very, very important hinge point in human origins, because what has really made us who we are today to a very large extent is our large, unbelievably highly creative brain, which happens to be the hungriest organ in our body. Even at night, it's using up calories. So if you are on a strictly vegetarian diet, you may not have enough energy to support not only the digestion and the brain expansion. So this shift to the beginning of incorporating high protein and amino acids and fats in bone marrow or whatever became available to feed an increasingly large brain over time. And one of my colleagues at the Institute of Human Origins that I founded many years ago, recently she was off at a site about, I guess, 50, 75 kilometers northeast of where I found Lucy. And her team, an Ethiopian scholar, in fact, found this lower jaw, this fragment of mandible. And what is so intriguing about that mandible is that in the front of the jaw, it's sloping like it is in apes and in afarensis. But in the back of the jaw, where the ascending ramus connects it with the cranium, you see all of the molars exposed in side view, which is a homo character. And the teeth in that lower jaw are long and narrow. And this is the oldest evidence we have for the genus Homo. And what's so fascinating about that for us is that that is only about 100,000 years after afarensis vanishes from the geological record. And what was happening at that time is well known because we have paleoecologists, we have people studying fossil pollen and telling us what the vegetation was like. We have people studying the diversity of animals. And all of a sudden, at that time, they have detected that plants are living in are more dry weather plants rather than tropical rainforests. And also that there was an enormous diversity in grass-eating animals like baboons and antelopes and that are grazers. And there was a drying in the environment, and we think that this had played a significant role. So today, the human family tree is quite different. We have an ancestor to afarensis, which is called Australopithecus anamensis. And you can see the similarities in lateral view. They have projecting faces. Takes us back to about 4.2 million years. And on the Australopithecus side, there is a marvelous skull found at Lake Turkana in northern Kenya that is 2.5 million years old, right at the median point between the extinction of Lucy and the emergence of that big, robust Australopithecus we saw. And that is Australopithecus ethiopica, which has a very projecting face, not a flat face like its descendants, and a projecting face like afarensis, and serves as an intermediate form. There's another strange species that's been found called Australopithecus gari, and that also has an anatomy reminiscent of afarensis, but so many features in the teeth and jaws and cranium that make it a distinct difference. And there is that little upper jaw we found, and Dr. Kay Reed's lower jaw. And what was so dramatic about my presentation in 1978 in Karlskoga was that I put the South African fossils, which are known as A. africanus, based on the Tong child, as you know, that led to robustus on a side branch. And I feel to this day that, you know, Africa is interesting because it's very long, longitudinally. And it has so many different environments. And I think the common ancestor, which I have postulated as afarensis, was evolving independently in southern Africa and eastern Africa, that these were different evolutionary arenas, responding to different climates, different diets, different pressures, and I remove them as the common ancestor. So this is a remarkable insight, and we can pass that, to understanding at least the relationships as we know them now, and I'm sure they'll change. But if we look at it without time and geography and so on, and just as a cladogram, I think the first thing, as you see, is the separation from chimpanzees, or separations from a common ancestor. And what we see is that back as much as close to 4 million years, there are a number of specimens that have small canines. Does that mean there was a reduction in intra-group aggression? We don't know. But that's one of the things that seems to be happening. And then bipedalism is probably the next feature that Darwin spoke so much about. There was enlarged cheek teeth. When you look at arboreal animals, their food is very different from those animals that live on the ground, where their vegetation tends to be tougher and in need of more mastication. And then there was dietary specialization in terms of Boisei and Robustus and Aethiopicus. And then there was a significant change in the size of the appearance of tools at about 2.6, as I said. And then reduction in tooth size that might reflect the fact that processing food at that time took less mastication and also was done outside of the oral cavity. And we began to see increasing encephalization and increase in brain size. And later on, we see very significant craniofacial specializations between ourselves and our closest relative Neanderthals. We were hoping that Svante Pabo would be here, and I was so sorry that he had to cancel. But clearly, whether we like it or not, we all carry Neanderthal genes because some of our ancestors actually interbred, but that's a whole different presentation. So I've divided them into sort of the pre-Homo types, because they're not all Australopithecus. There's Ardipithecus, and there's Sahelanthropus, and so on. And this group, which are, sorry, I have to go through all that again. Let's see. Pre-Homo and Homo on the right. This is more of a detailed phylogeny that I show you, and it shows you that there were many false starts. We tend to think that it was a straight line from ape to angel, and of course we all know we are the angels. But there were many species that were very well adapted and geographically widespread, but ultimately faced extinction. And as that bumper says, extinction is forever. You heard that in the introduction that Lucy has influenced, in many ways, different ideas and scholars. And one of those that I'm going to end with is about 6 years ago, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, a senior scientist, approached me, and he said that he was fascinated with how my work illuminated the understanding of our origins, and he was interested in understanding the origins of our solar system. And he submitted a proposal to NASA, a $1 billion proposal, to launch a mission that he wanted to call the Lucy mission. Because as Lucy had enhanced our understanding of us, this mission was to go to the Trojan asteroids, which were trapped in Jupiter's orbit and revolve around the sun with Jupiter, 300 million miles out there. And they believed that these were some of the least altered asteroids that might divulge interesting new clues to how our solar system came to be what it is today. And just this, and you see in the background there, my wife and I were at the launch in Florida and which went off very, very well. Fortunately, the craft is out there. It came back once for a gravity assist to go back out. And after that gravity assist last November 1st, it passed an asteroid that was called Dinkinesh, the Ethiopian name for Lucy. And here's something probably not much bigger than this room that's 300 million miles out there, that the spacecraft is going, tens of thousands of kilometers per second, and it took pictures of that asteroid. And eventually we'll reach the Trojan asteroids and hopefully send back interesting data that may give us more insights into the origins of our solar system. I just want to end with the fact that my work has led me to certainly reflect on this fragile planet that we have. We really have no place to move to. I think in many ways we need to really make or reinvent a reverence for the natural world, so that our descendants in the future will look back on us with admiration rather than disdain. So thank you very much.